The night shift is never truly quiet. Behind the stillness, something always watches. These are 50 terrifying stories of what happens after midnight. Welcome to the Night Shift Horror Stories. Story 1. The Man on the CCTV. Marcus had worked security at the corporate office for years. Most nights were the same. Empty hallways, humming lights, and the occasional raccoon tripping the outdoor sensors. He would sit in front of the CCTV wall, sipping cheap coffee, watching nothing. But one night at 2:47 a.m., he saw something that froze his blood. On the feed for camera 6, positioned over the east hallway, there was himself, sitting at the desk, staring directly into the camera. At first, Marcus thought it was a glitch, maybe a playback loop. But when he leaned closer to the screen, the figure on camera smiled, his own face grinning back at him. And Marcus hadn't moved. He spun in his chair, eyes darting to the real hallway outside the security office. Empty, silent. Yet on the monitor, his double stood up from the desk and began walking toward the camera, step after step, growing closer. When it reached the lens, the screen cut to static. The next morning, his supervisor asked why Marcus had clocked out twice, once at 6 a.m. and once again 5 minutes later. Story 2. The Patient in Room 304. Nurse Angela knew Room 304 well. The patient there, Mr. Reynolds, had passed away 2 nights earlier after a long battle with lung cancer. The bed was stripped bare. The chart was closed. So when she walked past Room 304 and heard coughing inside, her chest tightened. She peeked in. Mr. Reynolds sat upright in the bed, oxygen mask strapped on, pale eyes following her every movement. Her throat went dry. "And Mr. Reynolds?" she whispered. He pulled the mask down. "Hi, I'm not finished yet." His voice rattled, filled with fluid. Angela stumbled back, and in the blink of an eye, the bed was empty again. Just white sheets, tucked tight. But later, when she checked the computer system, there was a new entry under his chart. A note typed at 3:04 a.m. "Don't close me out." Story 3. The Locked Gas Station Bathroom. Rico hated the night shift at the gas station. Drunks, creeps, and hours of silence. But the worst was the bathroom. Every night at 2 a.m. sharp, the single-stall bathroom would lock from the inside. He'd jiggle the handle, knock, even use the spare key. Nothing. An hour later, it would unlock on its own. Always empty. One night, he decided to outsmart it. He waited outside at 1:55, flashlight in hand, key ready. As soon as the lock clicked shut, he shoved the key in, turned it, and burst inside. The bathroom mirror was fogged over as if someone had taken a shower, though there was no shower there. And written in the condensation, smeared with a finger, "You're late." The door slammed behind him. Story 4. The Last Passenger. Dan drove buses on the midnight line, routes through half-abandoned neighborhoods. At the last stop, an old woman climbed aboard. Thin, frail, wrapped in a shawl that smelled like damp soil. She said nothing, just sat in the very back. Dan drove the usual loop. Each stop, he called out, but she never moved. Finally, they reached the depot. "End of the line, ma'am," he said. No answer. He walked to the back. The seat was empty. Just wet footprints leading down the aisle, dripping into the floor. That night, he asked the depot manager if he'd ever seen her. The man's face went pale. "Yeah, she gets on every few years. Nobody ever sees her get off." Story 5. The Elevator That Shouldn't Stop. Hospitals at night are bad enough, but what terrified Mateo was the elevator. It was supposed to skip the basement. That floor had been closed off after a flood years ago. But sometimes, during the night shift, it stopped there anyway. The door slid open to a hallway lined with flickering lights, water-stained walls, and the smell of rot. One night, alone, Mateo decided to test it. He rode down, pressed the button, and the doors opened to the basement. Except this time, the lights were bright. The floor was dry. Nurses and doctors bustled past, talking in voices he couldn't quite hear. "Hello," he called out. No one looked at him. Then one figure turned. A doctor with hollow eyes and a smile too wide. "Been waiting for you," the figure said. The doors slammed shut, and when they opened again, he was back in the lobby. But his shoes left wet footprints wherever he walked. Story 6. The Nurse Call Light. Janice, a night nurse, hated the sound of the nurse call button. The sharp ding followed by a blinking red light. It meant someone needed help, and most of the time it was routine, water, a blanket, pain medication. But the call light in room 12 hadn't been routine for years. The patient there, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, had died one rainy Tuesday. Since then, every so often, the light would blink during the night shift, always at 3:12 a.m. One evening, Janice decided to answer it anyway. She opened the door to find the room empty, bed neatly made, monitor unplugged. She started to leave when she noticed the call button clutched in the middle of the sheets. Someone had pressed it. When she picked it up, a whisper hissed against her ear, but the sound didn't come from the room. It came from the intercom clipped to her uniform. Still waiting. Story 7, the toll booth. Eddie worked alone at the bridge toll booth, graveyard shift. Very few cars came through after midnight. The isolation didn't bother him until he started recognizing one of the cars. A black sedan, windows tinted, passed at exactly 2:23 every night. The driver never spoke, just handed him crumpled bills with a shaking hand. Eddie noticed the man's skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept in years. Curious, Eddie checked the booth's log cameras one night. The sedan was never there. No license plate, no car. Just Eddie, leaning out, taking money from thin air. The next night, the car pulled up again. Eddie hesitated before taking the bills. They were damp, sticky. When he looked closer, the notes were smeared with red fingerprints. Story 8, the morgue freezer. Clara hated nights in the hospital morgue. It was always too cold, the freezers buzzing, bodies zipped away in silence. She did her best to avoid looking at the tags on the toes. One night, she heard banging, soft at first, then louder, coming from one of the drawers. She froze, praying it was her imagination. Then came a muffled scream. Against every instinct, Clara slid the drawer open. The bag inside twitched violently. She unzipped it, expecting a patient mistakenly declared dead. But inside, there was nothing, just crumpled sheets of paper, each with her name written over and over again. She shoved the drawer shut and backed away. Then, every freezer in the morgue clicked open at once. Story 9, the gas station customer. Mark was sweeping the convenience store floor at 3 a.m. when the bell chimed. A customer walked in, tall, lanky, wearing an old-fashioned suit. His face looked wrong, stretched too thin, eyes too far apart. He didn't browse. He walked straight to the counter and placed a single penny down. "For the road," he rasped. Mark forced a laugh. We don't sell anything for a penny." The man tilted his head. "Then keep the change." He turned and walked out. Mark picked up the coin. It was ice cold, almost burning his fingers. When he set it down, the year engraved on it made his stomach drop. 1897. The next night, the penny was back on the counter, even though he'd locked it in the register. Story 10, the cleaning lady. In office towers, night janitors are often invisible. Maria liked it that way. Empty halls, no interruptions. But one night, while vacuuming the 12th floor, she noticed another cleaning lady ahead of her. The woman wore the same uniform, pushing the same cart. Maria felt a rush of relief. Maybe she wasn't alone. She called out, "Hey, which floor are you on tonight?" The woman stopped, slowly turned her head. Her face was blurred, like static on a screen. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just shifting gray. Maria stumbled back. The vacuum cut out. When she looked again, the hallway was empty. The next morning, her supervisor asked why she had logged out twice from her time card. Once at 6 o'clock, and again at 6:03. Story 11, the last bus stop. Derek drove the city bus night route. At 2:45 a.m., he always stopped at a lonely bus shelter on the edge of town. Nobody ever boarded there, until one night, a woman in a long black coat climbed aboard. She never spoke, never paid, just sat at the back staring out the window. Derek tried asking her where she was going. Silence. At the end of the line, he turned to tell her the route was over. The bus was empty. The air smelled like rotting flowers. The next night, she was there again, waiting at the same stop. Story 12, the call center. Nina worked night shift at a customer support call center. Most of the time it was spam calls or complaints. But one night, her headset clicked on, and a voice whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." Confused, she asked which account the caller needed help with. The voice repeated, slower, "You're not supposed to be here." She yanked the headset off, but the voice kept coming, echoing from every workstation around her. All the phones in the empty cubicles lit up at once. Every caller ID read the same thing, Nina's home number. Story 13, The train yard. Leo, a night security guard, patrolled the abandoned train yard. Most of the cars were rusted hulks, empty for decades. At 1 a.m., he heard music drifting from one of the cars, faint jazz, like from an old record player. When he climbed aboard, the car was lit by flickering lanterns. Passengers in outdated clothing sat quietly, faces hidden in shadow. The music stopped. Every head turned toward him in perfect unison. He bolted out of the car, but when he looked back, the train was gone. Just rusted tracks under a moonless sky. Story 14. The Silent Patient. During her residency, Emily was assigned night shift in the psych ward. One patient, known only as Mr. Gray, never spoke. He just sat staring at the wall. At 3 a.m., she passed his room and froze. He was standing directly against the glass, his face inches from hers, lips moving rapidly. She couldn't hear anything, but she swore he was whispering her name. The next day, she checked his file. He had been catatonic for 6 years. He didn't know her. He wasn't supposed to. That night, her name was carved into the wall inside his room. Story 15. The Gas Station TV. At the gas station, an old security TV displayed black and white feeds of the pumps. Dean was used to the static and flickers, but one night, he noticed something off. On the screen, a man was standing at pump 4, staring directly into the camera. Dean rushed outside, but the lot was empty. When he returned, the man was still there, now closer, face pale and grinning. Dean unplugged the TV, but the screen stayed on, the figure pressing its face against the glass, lips mouthing words Dean couldn't hear. Story 16. The Parking Garage. Lisa hated the underground garage where she worked nights. The place echoed like a cave. One night, she heard footsteps behind her, fast, heavy, following her across the concrete. She spun around, but no one was there. Then came a low growl, so close she felt it in her bones. She sprinted to the exit stairwell, fumbling her keys. When she looked back, a shadow stretched across the floor, long, twisted, and crawling on all fours. Story 17. The Radio DJ. Kyle worked the overnight shift as a local radio DJ. He played songs, read ads, and cracked jokes into the microphone. One night, a caller requested a song that wasn't in the station's system. Old, obscure. Kyle laughed it off. Minutes later, the track started playing by itself, audio files glitching until the tune poured out of the speakers. It was a slow, distorted lullaby. Kyle hadn't cued it. The phone rang again. Same voice, whispering, "Thank you for playing my song. See you soon." The station's log showed the call had come from the studio's own phone line. Story 18. The Warehouse. Miguel worked overnight in a shipping warehouse, organizing boxes. At 4 a.m., he noticed one crate wasn't logged in the system. The label just read, "Do not open." Of course, curiosity won. He pried it open and nearly gagged. Inside was a mirror, but warped, like the glass was liquid. His reflection smiled, but he wasn't. Before he could react, the reflection stepped forward. Miguel blacked out. When his co-workers found him, he was inside the crate. The mirror was gone. Story 19. The Maintenance Tunnel. Security guard Rick patrolled a hospital's underground tunnels. He hated the long, narrow halls. One night, he spotted a child at the far end of the tunnel. She was barefoot, wearing a hospital gown, hair covering her face. He called out, but she didn't respond. When he chased her down, the tunnel stretched longer, impossibly so. The girl kept the same distance, no matter how fast he ran. Then the lights flickered out. When they came back, she was inches from his face, grinning with teeth too sharp. Story 20. The Motel Guest. Working the front desk at a roadside motel, Abby was used to shady travelers. But one night, a man checked in with no luggage, no ID, just cash. Hours later, Abby reviewed the security tape. The man walked into room 6. Minutes later, the door opened again, but no one came out. When Abby checked the room at dawn, it was spotless. Bed made, key card on the table. The man's name never appeared in the system. But on the guest logbook, in jagged handwriting, 2 words had been added under room 6, still here. Story 21. The Library Basement. Clara worked nights at the Old City Library, organizing returns. The basement archives were always quiet, filled with dust and forgotten shelves. One night, she heard pages flipping. She followed the sound and found an open book lying on the floor. The words were still moving across the page. rearranging themselves into a message, "Get out." Clara dropped the book and ran upstairs. Hours later, she returned to lock up. Every single book in the basement was lying open on the floor. Every page spelled the same thing. Story 22, The Elevator. Marcus worked as a janitor in a high-rise office tower. During night shifts, he often used the service elevator. One night, he pressed the button for floor 1, but the elevator kept descending, past the basement, past anything that should exist. The numbers on the display glitched, -3, -8, -14. When the doors opened, the hallway was pitch black except for a single figure at the far end. It began sprinting toward him. Marcus smashed the button, and the doors slammed shut. He never used the elevator again. But sometimes, when it opens for him, it still shows floors that don't exist. Story 23, The Theater Projection Room. Eli worked the overnight shift at a rundown movie theater. His job was to monitor the projector during late shows. One night, the film reel began playing on its own. The footage wasn't a movie. It was surveillance of Eli himself, sitting in the projection booth, exactly as he was now. Then, on screen, the door behind him opened. Slowly, Eli turned around. The booth was empty. When he looked back at the film, the version of himself on screen was gone, replaced by something taller, with his face but eyes too dark, smiling too wide. Story 24, The Morgue Drawer. Hannah, a night nurse, was sent to the morgue to retrieve paperwork. She passed rows of cold drawers, trying not to look. As she walked by, one of the drawers slid open by itself. A pale hand reached out, fingers twitching. Hannah froze, unable to scream. The tag on the corpse's wrist read, "Unidentified female." Shaking, Hannah pushed the drawer closed. But as she left, she glanced back. Now, every drawer was slightly open, hands reaching, fingers beckoning her to come closer. Story 25, The Toll Booth. Working nights at a highway toll booth was lonely. Then usually saw only a few cars an hour. One night, a black car pulled up. The driver had no face, just smooth, blank skin where features should be. It handed him a crumpled bill with a shaking hand. Dan dropped it in shock. When he looked up, the car was gone. He checked the surveillance footage later. The booth camera showed him talking and taking money, but there was no car, and he was speaking to empty air. Story 26, The Hospital Stairwell. Natalie, a night shift nurse, avoided the back stairwell. The light bulbs flickered and the steps creaked like they were alive. One night, she heard a child crying from below. Against her better judgment, she went down. The stairwell kept spiraling, far longer than the hospital's 3 floors. Finally, she reached the bottom, or what she thought was the bottom. The crying stopped. The stairwell door opened to a hallway she'd never seen before, lined with beds. Each bed was occupied by a patient. Each one was dead. Story 27, The Janitor's Closet. Eric cleaned offices overnight. One building had a storage closet that always made him uneasy. The door was heavy, hard to open. One shift, he heard banging from inside. Thinking someone was trapped, he pulled it open. The closet was pitch dark, deeper than it should have been. Something shuffled in the blackness, breathing hard. Eric slammed the door shut and locked it. The next night, the banging came again, louder, and this time, the door handle twisted from the inside. Story 28, The Rest Stop Bathroom. Maya managed a highway rest stop overnight. At 3 a.m., she checked the bathrooms. One stall was locked. She knocked. Silence. She looked under the door. 2 bare feet stood there, motionless. She waited. Minutes passed. The feet never moved. She banged harder, shouting. Nothing. Finally, she crawled under the stall. It was empty. The feet were gone. But when she stood, the stall door slammed shut behind her. Story 29, The Security Monitor. At a museum, Ben watched the security monitors during night shifts. The cameras were fixed on priceless artifacts. One night, he noticed something strange. The statues were moving. On screen, they turned their heads, shifted their arms, walked slowly through the halls. Ben ran to check in person. Everything was perfectly still. When he came back to the monitors, the statues were all crowded against the camera, faces pressed to the lens. Story 30, The Factory Whistle. Luis worked the night shift at an old textile factory, long past its prime. At midnight, he heard the factory whistle blow, a sound that hadn't worked in decades. Moments later, the machines powered on by themselves. Looms rattled, gears turned, as if invisible workers had returned to their stations. Through the steam, Louise saw figures moving between the machines. Tall, gaunt shadows, bent and broken, repeating the motions of their work. The whistle blew again. The machine stopped. The figures vanished. But Louise swore he could still hear the sound of weaving whenever he closed his eyes. Story 31. The call center. Rachel worked the overnight shift at a call center. Most nights were quiet, but one line always lit up around 2:15 a.m. She answered, "Customer service, how can I help you?" A child's voice whispered, "He's in the house." Rachel froze, unsure what to say. "Excuse me? Who's in the house?" The line went dead. Next night, the call came again. Same time, same child's voice. This time, the whisper said, "He's closer now." Rachel checked the call logs. The line wasn't connected to any number. The third night, when the phone rang, she didn't answer. Instead, she listened as the voicemail picked up. The whisper was clear. "Now he's behind you." Story 32. The hotel room service. Diego worked night shifts at a downtown hotel. Around 1 a.m., room 609 called for extra towels. He brought them up, but when he knocked, no one answered. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dark, and the air was freezing cold. On the bed sat a woman with her back to him, hair long and black, her shoulders twitching as if she was sobbing. "Ma'am," Diego asked softly. The woman stopped shaking. Slowly, she turned her head. Her face was gray, her eyes two black pits. The room lights flickered, and when they came back, the bed was empty. Story 33. The empty subway. Martin was a subway operator. On his overnight route, he often drove empty cars through the city. One night, the reflection in the glass didn't match the empty seats. Dozens of passengers sat in the reflection, pale, hollow-eyed people staring straight at him. When he turned around, the car was still empty. Then, in the reflection, one of them stood and walked toward him. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Story 34. The gas station freezer. Lena managed a gas station overnight. One night, she went into the walk-in freezer to restock. The heavy door swung shut behind her. The lights buzzed. Her breath turned white. Then, through the frost, she saw handprints forming on the glass, from the inside, right where she stood. She pressed her hand against them. The frost melted, revealing a pale face staring at her. The door opened suddenly, and she stumbled out. But when she looked back, the handprints remained. Story 35. The radio broadcast. On night patrol, Officer Clark's radio crackled with static. Then a voice came through, urgent and panicked. "Unit 4, I need backup. He's got a knife?" Clark froze. There was no Unit 4 in his department. The transmission kept going, screams, gunfire, silence. Later, he checked dispatch. No record of the call existed. The next night, it came again. Same time, same screams. He realized it was a recording. But if it was a recording, whose death was he listening to? Story 36. The abandoned mall. Sam was hired to guard a mall closed for renovations. At night, it was empty except for echoes of his footsteps. One night, he heard the escalators running. Curious, he approached. On the second floor, mannequins were arranged in a circle, facing inward, as if in prayer. He blinked, and they were facing him instead. The sound of children laughing filled the mall. Sam dropped his flashlight. When he picked it up, the mannequins were gone. Story 37. The patient chart. Maya, a nurse, was updating files on the night shift. She picked up a chart for a patient named Gregory West. The problem, no one by that name was admitted. She flipped through the pages. Each note described her, her movements, her thoughts, even what she was writing at that moment. At the bottom, a final note had been added. Maya looks up and realizes she isn't alone. Story 38. The silent diner. Kyle worked nights at a 24-hour diner. Around 3 a.m., a group of people came in, 5 of them, all dressed in black, all smiling too wide. They sat in silence, staring at him as he poured coffee and took orders. When he turned to the grill, he heard their voices all at once, chanting something low and guttural. When he spun around, the diner was empty. The plates and cups were gone, but the coffee pot was still full, steaming on the counter. Story 39. The train tunnel. Ella was stationed at the entrance of an unused train tunnel, part of an old subway expansion. Every night at 2:30, she heard the whistle of an oncoming train. The ground rumbled. Lights flickered. She braced herself, but no train ever appeared. One night, she stepped inside to look. The sound roared toward her, lights blinding. At the last second, she pressed against the wall. The train passed, silent, filled with screaming faces. When it was gone, the tunnel was empty. But her watch read 4:30 a.m. 2 hours had vanished. Story 40, the parking garage. Tom worked overnight security at a parking structure. Around 1 a.m., he spotted a woman on camera, walking alone on level 5. He went to check. The floor was empty. Back at the monitors, he saw her again, this time standing directly behind him, staring into the camera. He spun in his chair. The room was empty. The monitor flickered. The woman's face filled the screen, eyes wide and unblinking, whispering something he couldn't hear. Story 41, the hospital elevator. Anna worked nights as a hospital janitor. The elevators were always busy, except after midnight, when most patients slept. At 2 a.m., one elevator opened on the basement level. No one was inside, but the panel glowed B2, a floor that didn't exist. Curious, Anna stepped in. The doors closed. The elevator descended, far deeper than the building allowed. When it opened, a corridor stretched endlessly, lined with doors. She heard moans and whispers behind each one. Then the doors began opening, one by one. Story 42, the highway patrol. Officer Diaz pulled over a car on the deserted highway at 3 a.m. The driver sat still, staring straight ahead. License and registration? Diaz asked. The man turned slowly. His face was pale, lips blue. His eyes were gone, just black, empty sockets. Diaz stumbled back. The man whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped me." The headlights went out. When Diaz blinked, the car was gone. Story 43, the museum guard. Paul guarded the city museum overnight. One exhibit, an ancient statue, always made him uneasy. Its eyes seemed to follow him. One night, he heard stone grinding. The statue's arm had shifted. Later, its head was turned. At 4 a.m., he passed the exhibit again. The glass case was shattered. The statue stood in the hallway, closer to the exit. By morning, it was back in its case, perfectly intact. No one believed him. Story 44, the cemetery groundskeeper. Victor maintained an old cemetery, working nights to avoid the sun. One evening, he noticed fresh footprints in the wet soil, leading from a grave that had been filled decades ago. The prints circled the grounds, then stopped in front of his shack. When Victor opened the door, muddy footprints led across his floorboards and into his bedroom. Story 45, the grocery stocker. Diane stocked shelves in a 24-hour supermarket. At 2 a.m., she noticed the canned goods spelling out words, "Leave now." She laughed nervously, thinking it was a prank. But each time she turned away, the letters rearranged. Finally, the can spelled, "Too late." The overhead lights went out. When they came back, Diane was alone in the aisle, but every can had turned to face her. Story 46, the library basement. Liam was tasked with organizing the library's basement archives overnight. Dusty shelves stretched forever, filled with forgotten books. He pulled one out at random. The title read his full name. Inside were pages describing everything he had done that night, down to the second. The last page was blank, except for one line. Liam hears footsteps behind him. Story 47, the toll booth. Samantha worked the graveyard shift at a lonely toll booth. Cars rarely passed. At 3:30 a.m., a hearse drove through. The driver handed her a coin, cold as ice, and whispered, "For your passage." The booth lights flickered. When they steadied, the road was empty. No tire marks, no car in sight. She opened her hand. The coin was ancient, tarnished silver, stamped with her own face. Story 48, the morgue attendant. Eli worked nights at the morgue. He was used to silence, used to stillness. But one night, a body sat up. Its mouth opened, and Eli heard his mother's voice. "Come with me, son." Frozen in terror, he watched as the corpse smiled, teeth chattering. Then it lay back down. When Eli checked the tag, the name was his. Story 49, the theater projectionist. Nora ran film reels for an abandoned theater occasionally rented for private shows. One night, she played the requested reel, but the film wasn't what had been sent. Instead, it showed her sitting in the booth, staring at the screen. She gasped. On screen, her reflection turned and smiled at her. The theater behind her filled with laughter. But when she turned, the seats were empty. Story 50, The lighthouse keeper. James kept watch in a coastal lighthouse. On stormy nights, the beam swept across the waves to guide ships. One night, he saw a vessel in distress, lights flickering. He radioed for help, but no one responded. When the beam swung back, the ship was closer, impossibly close, riding straight into the rocks. He braced for impact, but the ship vanished. When the beam swept again, James saw it anchored offshore. On deck stood dozens of pale figures, all staring at the lighthouse, waiting.